the slave diet and generational disease. When you type in the word Caribbean in Google Images, you get a whole lot of pictures of the beach, blue sky, palm trees, clear water. In the minds of many, the Caribbean is a place of paradise and fantasy, a place to go on vacation and to let time pass you by. But beyond the beaches of the Caribbean are the Caribbean people, an incredibly diverse people with great depth and uniqueness of art, culture, cuisine, and spirituality, united by a common history and a common destiny. There is another face to the Caribbean, though, as the region is also suffering from a health crisis, with an epidemic of violence in the community, mental health issues among some, cancer, and communicable and non-communicable disease, among other things. Non-communicable disease is a particularly worrying trend in the Caribbean and among Africans in the diaspora in general. Diseases such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension, which place a strain on the health infrastructure, not to mention the emotional strain on families and communities. Interestingly, though, we see a much higher prevalence of non-communicable disease among Africans in the diaspora when compared to Africans on the continent. And this is despite the fact that diasporic and continental Africans are genetically related. Of all African people throughout the world, African Americans and African British have the highest prevalence of obesity and diabetes, followed by the Caribbean, and West Africans have the lowest prevalence of diabetes and excess weight. And a major question is why? Why do Africans in the diaspora suffer from chronic non-communicable diseases such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension at a higher rate than their West African relatives? To find clues, let's go all the way back to 1944 in Holland, in Europe. World War II was at its peak, with Hitler's Germany having invaded Amsterdam, the capital city of Holland. When the Nazi troops descended on the streets of Amsterdam, there were some who celebrated, but there were also many more who resisted. As a punishment for and to quell the growing resistance, Hitler blockaded the city such that food could not enter, and the people went into months of famine and starvation. And following the end of World War II, and well since the end of the Dutch famine, researchers have been discovering some interesting things about the descendants of women who were pregnant during the famine. In particular, the children and grandchildren of women who were pregnant during the Dutch famine had increased risk for increased fat mass or obesity, hypertension or high blood pressure, glucose tolerance or diabetes, and psychiatric disorders. But why? Why should a pregnant woman going through starvation have children and grandchildren who are predisposed to obesity, diabetes, and other so-called metabolic diseases? The answer to this question appears to be that we are older than we look. And what I mean by this is that when my grandmother was pregnant with my mother in 1958, half of the genetic material that makes me was present in the primordial egg cells developing in my mother when she was just a fetus. So, in the case of the Dutch famine, the pregnant women who were starved during that time were not the only ones impacted by the famine. Their developing children and their undeveloped grandchildren were also impacted by the nutritional deficiency of the famine. All of this points to a reconceptualization of so-called non-communicable diseases, since these diseases are arguably communicable across generations. In the case of the Dutch famine, malnutrition in pregnant women resulted in them having children and grandchildren who were at greater risk for metabolic diseases such as obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. However, studies in other populations have seen similar effects in pregnant women and their offspring who were subjected to other dietary stressors such as protein malnutrition, a high-fat diet, maternal obesity or excessive gestational weight gain, and maternal insulin resistance or pre-diabetic or diabetic state. The mechanism by which these dietary stressors during pregnancy can cause this multi-generational effect comes down to an exciting new field in biology called epigenetics, which means above genetics, and describes the factors outside of the genetic code which impact the expression of genes. For example, starvation can cause changes in the cellular environment, leading to a particular gene either being silenced when it is normally active, or it might be activated when it is normally silent. In the case of the Dutch famine, the starvation conditions experienced by pregnant women caused epigenetic changes in the fetus as well as the mother. Coming back to the health crisis amongst Caribbean people and other diasporic Africans, could a transgenerational effect, analogous to that seen in the Dutch famine, be an underlying cause of the current health status in the modern-day Caribbean? Because this effect is not limited to Africans in the Caribbean. It is also an issue in African Americans and African British, and it is not the case in Africans on the continent. And there is one thing that Africans in the diaspora have in common, but which distinguishes them from continental Africans, and it's this: the Ma'afa, or transatlantic slave trade, which occurred for 400 years from the 15th to the 19th centuries. During the Ma'afa, European slave ships transported enslaved Africans as commodities across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, where they were forced to labor without compensation on the plantations of the Caribbean, South America, and in the American South. The Ma'afa was essentially an economic program of capitalism, and like all capitalist programs, it sought to have maximum output from minimum input. What this meant in the context of the Ma'afa was that chronic malnutrition was a feature of life on slave plantations for enslaved Africans. In America, the so-called slave diet was described autobiographically by Frederick Douglass, who was born into and experienced slavery firsthand. He said, "We were allowed less than a half of a bushel of cornmeal per week, and very little else, either in the shape of meat or vegetables. It was not enough for us to subsist on." In the Caribbean, on the other hand, while there may have been differences in the specific foods given to enslaved Africans, the situation was similar to the antebellum American South, in that contemporary accounts of the slave diet describe it as being nutritionally inadequate. Dr. George Pinkard, who was stationed on the West Indian slave plantations, stated in 1796 that the food of the Negroes is very simple and but little varied, breakfast, dinner, and supper being similar throughout the year. It consists mostly of guinea corn with a small bit of salt meat or salt fish. This basic, unvaried diet led to a range of nutritional deficiencies, with the accompanying effects on health. Enslaved Africans in the Americas were chronically deficient in vitamin B12, vitamin A, calcium, zinc, folic acid, vitamin B1 or thiamine, niacin, protein, and vitamin C. It is also of note that many of these key dietary factors that were lacking in the so-called slave diet have been shown in animal models and human population studies to have transgenerational epigenetic effects. These nutritional deficiencies during pregnancy have been shown to result in increased risk of disease in offspring exposed to the deficiency in the uterus, similar to the case with the Dutch famine. It is worth noting that many historical and economic researchers have described the slave diet as being sufficient in adults, although there is general agreement that infants, children, and pregnant women were chronically malnourished. Yet other researchers have pointed out that while the adult slave diet may have been sufficient in amount, it was nutritionally or qualitatively deficient. Certainly, the archaeological excavation of skeletons on slave plantations have supported the anecdotal evidence of grossly inadequate nutrition during the Ma'afa. In particular, excavators found tooth and gum disease in excavated skeletons, suggestive of malnutrition. They also detected nutritional stress in skeletons from slave plantations in the antebellum American South. These included pathologies such as tooth and gum disease and pelvic and skull pathologies. There was also a general observation of high rates of infant mortality, low life expectancy, and low birth rate among enslaved Africans. So, during the Dutch famine, there was a dietary insult in a single generation of pregnant women, resulting in their descendants being at increased risk of metabolic disease. Whereas the situation is slightly different in diasporic Africans, in that there was no famine as such, but rather there were multiple dietary insults over the many generations of the Ma'afa. And this was due to the poor nutritional quality of the so-called slave diet in the Americas. Therefore, by analogy with the Dutch famine, did the nutritionally poor slave diet lead to the descendants of enslaved Africans being at increased risk of metabolic disease, as we see in the current day? We also need to research the causes and correlates of ill health, because it may be that these are grounds for reparations for the profit-driven malnourishment of enslaved Africans during the centuries of the Ma'afa. If, as the evidence strongly suggests, the current health situation in the modern day is caused by intergenerational epigenetic memory of past nutritional deprivation or trauma, then the statute of limitations would not have run out for reparations and restitution to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas. Overall, given this convincing evidence for a transgenerational effect of poor diet during the times of slavery, there is an urgent need to divert public health resources to investigate the current epidemic in the context of the emerging research from the field of epigenetics. The descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas must demand from their governments and other responsible organizations that there must be food equity and food justice. Healthy foods must be made affordable and accessible, especially to pregnant women. Foods like fruit, vegetables, whole grains, greens, and legumes. And importantly, there must be educational campaigns to increase public awareness if we are to reverse the health crisis silently taking hold among Africans in the diaspora. But the good news is that we can reverse these trends by taking action now. Studies show that transgenerational epigenetic changes caused by nutritional stress may be reversible through diet and lifestyle interventions such as healthy eating and exercise. We need a health revolution in the Caribbean and wider Americas, one that places primary value, perhaps for the very first time, on the health and well-being
of Africans in the Americas.